Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Portsmouth. My name is Jim Garman. I have been the town historian for a few years. We went through a 375th celebration 3 years ago, and some of us, and many of us that are working on the Historical Society now, were part of that planning and a number of events that took place about once a week during that year. How many of you are not familiar with Portsmouth geography? Trying to see if you, because I'm going to talk about some different locations in the town, and I just want to know, sometimes I think everybody knows them. I'll try to explain. First of all, for those of you that were at the picnic, it may or may not have been explained to you that where we were there was what was called the training ground for the original settlement of Portsmouth in 1638. The training ground was where each member, each free man of the society got a musket, a certain amount of powder and matches and balls in order to practice, and they had to practice when they marched, and that's where it was, right alongside that brook. The brook also was the source of water for the first settlers that came as well. It's called Founder's Brook, and it does drain down into a pond, into a bay, which eventually drains into Narragansett Bay. The absolute source of it, not completely clear of, but it's up on the hill above somewhere. It's a spring, I'm sure. So our town was founded 378 years ago, which is 1 year before Newport. We brag about that sometimes. And my mission today, I know all of you are, most of you anyway, are pretty familiar with Anne Hutchinson's biography. So I'm really going to talk mainly today about the founding of Portsmouth and how it came about, and then how Newport split off from Portsmouth. That's my intention of what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to go into Anne's trials or things like that up in Boston, because again, I think most of you, at least I'm sure Eve talked about those yesterday, the day before. So I contributed to Eve's book, by the way, some of the Portsmouth stuff in there when she was writing that. I've written 6 books myself on local history. All right, first of all, there are 3 primary founders of Portsmouth, and they're all important. They're all really important for long-term history in the United States. The first was William Coddington, a very wealthy man from Boston who came here. He was not banished, by the way, from Boston, but he came here, and before he came here, he was determined to be the judge or the magistrate. So he was the political leader of the colony that was about to be established. The second is the Reverend Dr. John Clark, Clark with an E on the end of it. John Clark had not been in Boston very long, but when he came along with the group, he's extremely important in American history. When you go to Newport, you look around, almost on every corner there's a church. There's a synagogue, there's a Baptist church, there's a Quaker meeting house, etc. There's all kinds of churches there. And his particular claim to fame was, in addition to providing the charter that was set up in 1663 for the Rhode Island colony, is that he believed very strongly in the concept of freedom of religion. And his emphasis on freedom of religion got into that document that became the founding document of the Rhode Island colony. And eventually, and I'm convinced of this, there are people who sometimes disagree, he was responsible for getting freedom of religion into the United States Constitution as well. So his role is really important too. There's a biography of him being written now, and there are Friends of John Clark organization in Newport. And of course, our today's honored guest, Anne Hutchinson. Very important, initially in kind of a negative way, in that she was banished from Boston along with a lot of her followers, and came here to Portsmouth. That reminds me, if you could put your cell phones on, sorry, on, I have to do it myself.
Airplane.
My apologies, I actually inadvertently turned on the video that promotes the celebration.
I always tell people that before I start, but I forgot today. Okay. So, but Anne, obviously, as you all know, was very important to the settlement of Portsmouth and critical in terms of her followers and so on that came here. As I said, the experience in Boston has been well covered, I'm sure, over the last few days, so I'm not going to go into that. But we start with our compact. Portsmouth has a compact. Actually, Portsmouth has 3 compacts. an idea I didn't realize until I started reading through some of these decisions that were made at the time of the settlement and at the time of the separation. There were books written in the early 20th century who just referred to the title of the chapter, The Separation. And that's when people went off to Newport. So the Compact of Portsmouth is an important document. It's such an important document that we have made copies of it. The document still exists. It's in the state archives. And when we had our Founders Day on March 7th this year, we had the actual compact here. And we got a really good high-res copy of it. And the Historical Society is in the process of selling those, if you're interested. Okay, so what they were setting up was a civil body politique. That phrase sounds a little bit odd, but it's also the same phrase that existed in the Mayflower Compact. That phrase is used as well there, which was 18 years before the Portsmouth Compact. The idea was that they're out more or less in the wilderness. It took them a while to get into the wilderness because first they went to a place near, Roger Williams took them to a place near Providence. It was called Soames, and Williams started to make his settlement there, and then he communicated with Boston and found out he was still in Massachusetts. So he moved across the river to Providence in 1636, just 2 years before Portsmouth was settled. So the compact was signed in Boston before they left. And meanwhile, in the spring, several people, including the Reverend Dr. John Clark, traveled around trying to find a place to go to. And they considered the Delaware Bay down in Delaware and Virginia, down that area. Then they considered Long Island, and they considered northern possibilities too, north of Salem, which also was a settlement part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so, but they found that the temperature in the northern part of the country was too cold. And they finally decided that they would, in communication with Roger Williams, that they had the opportunity to purchase this island and a couple other spaces around here as well. So Roger Williams was crucial. There is, by the way, and I really want to mention this if you haven't seen it already, it's been out a little while. There's a biography of Roger Williams written by John Barry, B-A-R-R-Y. It was pointed out to me a couple months ago, and I am about 90% through it. Here comes the person who pointed it out to me as well. John Barry's book. And it's outstanding. It goes into a lot of political theory, especially in England, and how the Puritans came about and so on. But it's really good as a biography of Roger Williams. I've never seen anything as good as that. John Barry, B-A-R-Y. And it has a funny name. It has some long title. But anyway, you can
It's
find
the soul of a new nation.
What is it? Yeah.
The
Soul of the New Nation, something like that. Anyway. Okay. So the compact was an agreement to band together to form a civil body politique and to be governed by God's law. Not governed by the King's law, not governed by the Massachusetts law, for sure. John Winthrop was not very popular here. But that they would agree to work together. So in other words, they were more or less, and a case can be made for this, but I'm not going to make it, the Declaration of Independence of sorts. And so they agreed to settle and to be governed, essentially governed by themselves. Okay? So among the people signing the compact, as you all know, was not Anne Hutchinson. The role of women was somewhat diminished at that point compared to anything that came along once we got into the 20th century. But it was signed by her husband, Will. He was the third signer. First was Coddington, second was Clark. And it's expected that it was written by John Clark. There's no absolute confirmation of that, but there are some religious representations, books and chapters and so on of the Bible that are written there, and some people actually have compared handwriting and they think it really was written by John Clark. Anyway, Will Hutchinson signed it, and Coddington signed it, and Clark signed it. They were the first three. Also signing it was Edward Hutchinson, Jr., who was the son of William and Anne Hutchinson, and Will's brother Edward, and Anne's son-in-law Thomas Savage. Okay? So it was almost a family document that way. Not all of them came to Portsmouth, by the way. Savage did not, and her son her son, I guess it's her son-in-law, became the governor of Massachusetts eventually, which is really bizarre when you think about it. So they looked around, they found a place, and they saw this island, and an island that had been discovered actually. Some people don't believe this, but Verrazano came into the to Narragansett Bay in 34, 35, somewhere around there. And Verrazano wrote a description, which is just about impossible to read. It's in English, but English of the 16th century. But he does describe what he saw here. They didn't stay, obviously, didn't make a settlement. So they purchased the island of Quidnick, which is our island that we are on right now. Sometimes we don't feel like an island, but we are. And the island is about 15 miles long and about 4 or 5 miles at its widest part. So they purchased this from the Narragansett Indians, who were in this area, more in the area across the bay, across Narragansett Bay, in what we call South County today. That's where they were headquartered. And there were two main stations here, and they were, and these names are familiar to locals because we still have these names around, Miantinomi and Canonicus. Okay, those names should be familiar to locals anyway. So they signed the compact, they looked around, they found this and decided to come here. The Indians agreed to the purchase, and the price of the purchase, somewhat like $24 for Manhattan, was 20 fathoms of white beads. In addition, they would provide 10 rakes and 20 hoes, garden hoes, and as part of that agreement was because, and the Indians agreed that they would leave the island. Okay. There were Indian settlements on this island back in the pre-1638 period. So they had the island, they had the compact. A lot of them had to get out of Boston by spring, including Anne, and so they came here, the first settlers came here to the northern end of the island, not far from where we were this morning for the picnic. And they lived in very primitive quarters. In some cases, holes dug in the ground, covered over. In other cases, lean-tos. And eventually they began, and they started farming right away. It was good farmland. Portsmouth's a farming community, as you found out this morning when you were at the Founder's Brook, because the tractor was going in the next field there. Still is a rural community, although it's becoming more suburban these days. Anyway, so they came here at very primitive conditions and began to build farms and began to build homes. And there's no record really of what their houses looked like, but I think if you think about it, it's almost a contemporary time. If you look at Plymouth Plantation, you know, it was sort of that kind of thing. Fairly crude houses and so on, and most of them, all of the freemen got a 2-acre house lot at the northern end of the town. Okay? And then they eventually did a land distribution, and most of the people got as much as 200 acres of farmland further to the south, down this way. And that was the first settlements. Now, eventually, Will Hutchinson came in late March. And by the way, let me explain something. We don't know about the calendar in those days. It's really confusing. There was the new style, the old style, and the Aquidneck Island style. I have a book that has 3 paragraphs of an explanation of that. I wouldn't even try to confuse you by reading that. Because they talk about the first month in the spring, that's March, on one calendar. And so the dates are really up in the air there somewhere. But we accept 7 March as the founding of Portsmouth because of the compact. And we assume that was the correct date. But again, the calendar is really confusing. So they settled around what is called the town pond. The town pond is an open to the bay pond at the northwestern corner of the island. They could bring ships in there from Narragansett Bay. And also on the other side, on the east side, there was what was called the Great Cove. And that Great Cove is still there. And a lot of the settlements were either around the town pond or around the Great Cove. Again, the house settlements. And they were all relatively close. I was reading last night about when they had a town meeting, all freemen of the town had to come. And the town meeting would come about when they start to beat the drum. And when the drum was beating, it was time to go to the town meeting. And it stopped. And then if the drum started beating again, you better get there or they fine you. Actually, I think it was 6 shillings or something like that. Okay? So I guess that they did that. So Anne arrived here in early April. From all we can tell, she walked from Boston to Providence, from Wollaston actually, and she then got a ship from Providence down here. She arrived in early April, about a month after her husband had arrived here. And Coddington arrived here in April as well. Now, after Anne arrived, Governor Winthrop was so happy to see her gone, needless to say, and there was a small earthquake in this area. We've had a couple earthquakes. I can remember one in 1965 here, down off Secana Point. Anyway, there was an earthquake, and Winthrop, in his diary, said, and this is a quote, "This is proof of God's continued disquietude against the existence of Anne Hutchinson." So most of the compact signers came in the spring of 1638. They didn't all come. If you look at the compact, I don't have a copy of it here, I don't think.
Yes.
Oh, we have one?
Right there.
Where?
The compact?
Yeah.
It's on the painting, the facsimile.
Oh, yeah. You have a picture of it right
Not
there.
the real one.
We'll sell you a better copy. There are 4 names at the bottom of the compact that have a line drawn through them. And we don't know why. Either they decided they didn't want to come after they signed the compact or whatever. 3 of the 4 eventually did get here. And genealogists go crazy with all these first founders of Portsmouth. I was talking to a man 2 weeks ago who lives in Moscow, and he was checking out Richard Borden, who was one of the first settlers. He didn't sign the compact, but he was here in 1638. So genealogy comes all over the place. And I have to remind you, perhaps advise you, that even though I'm president of the Historical Society, I don't do genealogy. If it's Anne Hutchinson, we'll send you over to the Anne Hutchinson Friends. They can take care of it. Michael can take care of that for you. Anyway, it's hard enough doing my own genealogy, which I have done back in 1740. So they came then, and in the spring began to set up their settlement. What was really important at this early settlement was the town meeting. The town meeting was a meeting at which all free men of the society would gather to talk over their problems and what was going on in the town. And they were periodic. The first one was held on 13 May 1638, and they continued on frequently after that. I think it was almost weekly in some cases. And the town records list who was attending, which is really useful in terms of research and so on. The first town meeting, there were 12 freemen. We had another historian in the town and I who did battle about, 20 years ago, I guess it was. I've been in this town for 50-some years, by the way. But I wasn't born here. I'm a Pennsylvanian. Anyway, the other town historian said that he read in a book one time from 1915 that Portsmouth was the birthplace of American democracy. And they first put up some signs, town signs saying that. That's a stretch. First of all, yes, it was democratic if you were a free man. It did not include women. It did not include slaves, and there were slaves here. My son's an archaeologist, and he did some research here in Portsmouth, and found in the property of what had been William Freeborn, his original house, and he found African artifacts in an outbuilding there. There were slaves here almost from the beginning, as far as we can tell. So, the town meeting would decide all kinds of things. The town meeting, one of the things that they decided to do was to set up a bar. Okay. William Balston, on his property, was designated the person to have the bar. Of course, the bar was the place where they'd have the town meetings, and there would be guest rooms. And oh, by the way, speaking of birthplace of American democracy, if you were coming to visit someone, the person you were coming to visit had to pay a fee to allow you to come. Very democratic, I would say. But anyway, the other historian has passed on, and so I guess it's my battle now by myself. But I never quite accepted those signs they were putting up about birthplace. over time, in the first few years of the settlement, things were, everybody was just getting going, getting organized. But then there appeared a real nutcase in this history, a man by the name of Samuel Gorton.
Gordon?
Gorton, G-O-R-T-O-N. He had been forced out of a lot of communities. But he came here, I think it was like about 1639 or so. Yeah, it must have been 1639. And he allied himself with the followers of Anne Hutchinson. Now, what we would call him, I would think today, would be some kind of a liberal rabble-rouser. He was a troublemaker. He had been kicked out of Plymouth. He got kicked out of, I think it was Salem, somewhere up north before. And he came here, and he sort of joined forces with Anne Hutchinson as best we can tell. There's no primary sources, really, other than things like town meeting records and so on that really analyze this. So what happened was that Gorton was a proponent of civil rights. And Coddington, the judge, the magistrate, the mayor, if you will, didn't quite go along with that. He was more inclined towards the Puritan way of doing things and control on society. So what happens then in the spring of 1639 is that there come to be significant differences between the followers of Anne Hutchinson and the followers of William Coddington. And you throw into the pot Samuel Gorton, and it got pretty nasty. There weren't many people here then. Best guess is probably somewhere in the vicinity of 35 to 50 people, total people. There only were about 14, 15 by this time who were freemen in the town meeting records. And this dissension went on. One of the other interesting things as a sideline is that when these people came to found Portsmouth, no one set up a church. Okay? They did not have a church here. They didn't have churches here either. I'm not sure when the first one was, possibly the Quakers, in terms of a meeting house anyway, not exactly a church. But it took quite a while. And so, but Anne Hutchinson continued, as she had in Boston, to talk to people and have meetings and things like that. And so the difference is kind of both civil and religious. There was a significant split between the two. So what happens then, and it must have been a very dramatic scene. We have our compact was in a book, town records book. And after the compact were the meeting records, the minutes of the first year of town meetings. So apparently they were in a meeting, a town meeting on April 28th, 1639. And there was some discussion about a man by the name of William Aspinwall. And Aspinwall had somehow gotten into a lot of trouble. And there were supporters of him, and there were people who said he should be put in the stocks or put into jail or banished from Portsmouth. And so a split developed between these two sides at that meeting, a political fight between the two of them. And so what happens is that Coddington and his followers decide they're leaving. William Dyer was the clerk. They didn't have a secretary as such, but he was the clerk. He kept the records of the town meeting. So you actually can see this in the town meeting volume, which is listed under the Newport records, by the way. What they did was they closed up the book, left, took the records with them. So the Portsmouth records of those early town meetings are in the Newport archives in the State House. The compact somehow got removed from the record book. It stands separately. But as I said, we saw the compact on March 7th. And it's really phenomenal to see that thing and see these actual signatures of all these people. Really a neat thing. So Coddington and some of his followers, Coddington, Dyer, and a few others, decided they were going to go somewhere else on the island. So they decided to, what they said, they left to form another, quote, plantation in the midst of the island. Now among the people, for local people, you'll recognize these names. The 8 people that went with Coddington, Nicholas Easton, John Cogshall, William Breton, John Clark, Jeremy Clark, Thomas Hazard, Henry Bull, and William Dyer. Those are all very familiar landmark names on this island still. I mean, we have Cogshall Schools, we have Breton Point, we have all these things are local place's net. So they left and took their record book with them. And in leaving, this is an interesting consideration. They said they signed a compact among them saying that they were going to have this new settlement and that they would be governed by the laws of God. That's the second compact. Those who remained formed a third compact. And the first name on that is William Hutchinson. The third compact says that we're going to be governed by the just laws of King Charles. That's a real switch of direction, especially for those who signed the original compact. They were trying to get away from anything to do with England. So they said they were going to be governed by British law. So Coddington and his followers, Nicholas Easton was the first one, went down and founded Newport. Now Newport was not the Newport that you see today. The area of the waterfront in Newport was a swamp. And they cajoled people to come in to fill it in, mostly Native Americans, who were rewarded by various ways to fill in the waterfront. Now why did they go to Newport? This is an important thing too. Coddington was a wealthy man. He was a merchant. A lot of these people were merchants. They were looking for something perhaps a little more profitable than farming. So one of the main reasons why they went to Newport was for economic considerations. For a waterfront where they could have ships and they could get engaged in trade overseas, and it worked. Newport became a really major port. Even at the time of the American Revolution, there were 5 major ports along the East Coast. And they were Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Newport. Those were the 5 major ports in colonial America. However, during that war, and I'll just briefly mention this, during that war, the British occupied Newport for 3 years, almost 3 years. And that had a devastating effect. Newport never recovered economically, trade-wise, after that. In the 1790s and early 1800s, everything really, the economics of it really collapsed and was exacerbated by the War of 1812. So Newport never recovered. And it took till about 1840, 1850 before somebody said, hey, the weather's pretty good here. Why don't we build a summer home here? And that all started in the 50s, essentially. And we all know what happened after that. So, but Portsmouth was left behind, but not for long. Because what Coddington wanted to do, he was a certain amount of egomaniac, I would imagine. He wanted to be the governor of the Rhode Island colony. Now there were 4 settlements here in 1640. There was Providence, obviously, Roger Williams, Portsmouth, Newport, and a settlement founded by Samuel Gorton, Warwick, which is across the bay. Now, when you think about it, these people were in canoes and small boats, and yet they linked together somehow in one colony, these 4 communities. Communication must have been pretty difficult. And even at an early start, I'm not sure exactly what year this started, but both Newport and Providence were co-capitals. I do know that that lasted until about 1905, when it moved to Providence. We still have our State House here in Newport, which is something really worth seeing if you haven't seen it. So, what Coddington did as early as 1640 was to establish cooperation, first between Newport and Portsmouth, surprisingly, and then bringing in the other 2 settlements, and eventually he was named the governor of the colony of Rhode Island. That was in the 1640s somewhere. He died in 1676 as the governor of Rhode Island. He wasn't the governor the whole time, but he had come back to be the governor, and he died in office. So the government left behind in Portsmouth, Will Hutchinson was in charge of it. From what I understand, and maybe some of you genealogists can tell me different, Will was kind of a laid-back person. I guess he had to be in some ways. But he wasn't a hard-charging, we're going to do this, we're going to do that kind of person. he was pretty laid back. And of course, as you all know, in 1641 he died. And not long after that, Anne decided that it was time to move on. From what I understand, and again you may disagree with me on this, what I understand it was primarily because she still feared the absorption of Massachusetts and the various governors there. What's difficult even for locals to realize sometimes is that we are an island, and on that side of across the river that way, and the river isn't a river, it's a tidal estuary, but it looks like a river. Anyway, over there was Little Compton and Tiverton. And those are communities that were part of Massachusetts until 1747, I think it was. Okay. Along with Barrington, Cumberland, and some of the rest of Rhode Island. The discussion of the borders of Rhode Island is wonderful to read. It's so confusing. Who's going to get this? Who's going to get it? There's a house on the Connecticut-Rhode Island border that's split down the middle. Part of it's in Massachusetts, Connecticut, part of it's in Rhode Island. I mean, they had all kinds of fights about all that stuff. So anyway, Coddington very much got into the shipping business. And they shipped cattle and sheep and horses as far away as Barbados. The Barbados trade was a big part of what they were involved with, international trade. Clark, meanwhile, founded the First Baptist Church in Newport, which still exists, still functions. And he, along with Roger Williams, was responsible for, Williams got the first charter, then Williams and Clark went back to England, and they got what came to be the Charter of 1663. That charter also exists, by the way. It's on display in the State House in Providence. And that was a charter which very much said specifically, in this colony there will be freedom of religion. Okay? And so that's an important contribution of Dr. Clark. Freedom of religion goes way back here. So, in more or less summary, the colony came together, and gradually they brought in more territory, more towns, and so on, and eventually began to function. But they were somewhat independent of the other colonies. You probably noticed that most of the colonies were independent of one another. They didn't want to get dragged into other people's problems. Massachusetts, Boston had a hard time reining in Salem in the earliest days, because Salem was a place where people like Roger Williams went and sought independence. Even Boston and Plymouth took a long time to come together in a colony. Connecticut was something else. Connecticut was way over there someplace. And Thomas Hooker and other people who were there didn't really want much to do with anybody else, except when it came time later on for things like the Pequot War, where all the colonies said, oh, we better get together. Okay. The whole concept of colonial unity was very, very slow coming. So slow coming that Rhode Island ratified the Constitution, written in 1787. Rhode Island ratified it in 1791. The 13th state to ratify the Constitution, because we didn't want any part of those people. And when it was passed, the vote was, I think the vote was, I think it was 32 to 30, something like that. The state legislature or colonial legislature, it was really close. And there was a lot of dissent about not wanting to belong to the rest of the people. The colony actually was taken over the coals by George Washington, saying, shape up. At that time. So there's a certain feeling of independence. We have a statue on the top of our State House that is called the Independent Man. And that whole concept of independence is something that is time-honored in Portsmouth. Anyway, back to Anne Hutchinson. Okay, so Anne was here. We all know that she left here in 1643 and went way out west to the Bronx. What you have to understand, and a little bit of the details of it, is that New Netherlands, New Amsterdam, New Netherlands was a colony, and it went up the Hudson River with various estates, you know, those big estates that they had there. But the main settlement of New Amsterdam was about the bottom third of Manhattan. And they had walls. These walls have been excavated recently. They found walls that went across Manhattan to keep everybody out. And so the Dutch settlements there were controversial. The Dutch settlements go back to Henry Hudson. Was that 1640 something? I think so. Anyway, Anne settled out of the beyond the wall, and as most of you know, she and six of her children were murdered by the Suwannee Indians, who had a big gripe against the Dutch, but again, she was kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. One of her daughters survived, Susanna, who was taken by the Indians, lived with the Indians for about 9 years, and then came back. And all of you Hutchinson descendees are from, a lot of you are from Susanna. There were other Hutchinsons, however, again, her son, who went to Boston, or stayed in Boston, and other relatives and so on. And so that whole first generation is, well, I say the second generation, is very widespread. So there are a lot of descendants from, I give lectures in Portsmouth sometimes, and I ask how many descendants of Anne Hutchinson there are there, and I won't ask today because I think it's probably everybody. But a lot of people around here feel that they are descended from the original settlers, and mainly her. But her contribution obviously was very great. Her contribution to American history was very great. We really should be aware of her contribution that was here. It's really unfortunate that the role of women, that you're going to hear a little bit about at the wine tasting session, the role of women was really diminished, and that they didn't have a whole lot of rights. And again, I think a lot of us grew up at a time when, to me anyway, in the 40s and 50s, when women didn't have a whole lot of rights either. And their job, and I mean, you know, we talk about the Depression in the United States, that the unemployment rate was 31%. But the unemployment, the employed people were usually just the men. And so, you know, those figures are much enlarged beyond that. But I know, my mother didn't work until she had to, after my father died. But I think that her role as an outspoken member of the community, and her testimony in her trials is very noteworthy and very important to American history. She obviously was a woman with very strong values and good ideas in a lot of ways, except it was not the norm that we had in Puritan. And the Puritans viciously, for a while anyway, at least in her time in the 1630s, they viciously held on to this idea of a Puritan theocracy. And they let up on that fairly quickly after that. And it wasn't quite as severe by the 1660s and 70s. Of course, the whole Puritan thing changed because the Puritans came to power in England under Oliver Cromwell after they got rid of Charles I. And Cromwell ruled as the Lord Protectorate of England until he died in 1656, passed it on to his son Richard, who couldn't handle it, and then Charles II came back, the restoration of the monarchy. So the Puritan position, you know, changed based on their success in England. A lot of Puritans left Boston and went back to England when that revolution was going on. Again, read that book, John Barrett, Roger Williams. It's really good. It gets really deep into the political philosophy. But beyond that, it's a really excellent biography. He was an extraordinary individual. He really was. So, Anne, as we all know, and the common phrase is often used, was a woman beyond her time, before her time. And we certainly are very proud to celebrate her 425th birthday. And we're really proud to have her as founding mother of Portsmouth, of the settlement here. I think that's really, really special. So that's pretty much it. I will answer questions if you have them. Sure.
What kind of work did she do?
What kind of what?
Work.
She was a midwife. She delivered babies.
Oh, she was?
Mm-hmm.
Any of those early compacts, were they Rhode Island and Providence plantation?
Of the early what?
The early compacts, were any of those designated as Rhode Island and Providence plantations?
No, the compacts do not really, they just say we who are gathered here, essentially. The compacts do not relate to Rhode Island and Providence plantations. We had a big struggle in Rhode Island a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
There were people who wanted to take the concept. The state of Rhode Island was officially the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations.
Oh, yeah.
Plantations mean slavery. They don't, but that's what a lot of people thought. And we had a state referendum on that, but it stayed.
It was Benedict Arnold who was responsible for that.
Is that right?
Governor Benedict Arnold. He was the great
Yeah, not the-
grandson, a great grandfather of the tree.
I just wanted to mention that if Charles II, it was a very opportune time for the Puritans and the Pilgrims, but especially like for Roger Williams in relation to getting the Rhode Island Charter for religious freedom. It wouldn't have happened before Charles II if they had attempted it.
That's right.
And I just want to mention, because I've been like tying a lot of things together in relation to colonial history here. They have an exhibit at the Rhode Island State House where they put the original Rhode Island Charter, and they have Charles II, and they do a little history, whatever. And I still haven't called whoever put that together, because they don't say who Charles II's wife is. And Portugal had 2 royal marriages with the Brits, and Charles II married Catherine of Braganza of the north of Portugal. So that was, it's all tied to who helped Charles II survive and not get killed so that he could be put back on the throne. There was all this stuff going on behind the scenes that is all hidden history that has to do with the Sephardic Jews. So that's my project, so I've been digging, and I was like really irritated that it's like, well, Charles II married somebody, why don't you put her name there? It's like there's so many Portuguese people in Rhode Island, they left that whole piece out. It's like,
He was walking on eggs a lot during his
Catherine
administration. And
of Braganza, it's a
Parliament
city in
came
the
in
north.
control.
Excuse me?
Parliament was much in control during his administration because his father had been executed. So he just had to sort of be careful. Any other quick questions?
Yeah, Jim, before the churches were built around over here, they used to have a lot of circuit riders. Is that the reason the circuit riders came in to provide religious, instruction to the various communities before the churches and the pastors came in?
I'm not sure. I think most of it was a matter of communities with having a particular religious belief kind of gathered together. When the circuit riders came later, I think, really as things got spread out so much that they couldn't afford a minister or whatever.
200 years later.
Quite a while, yeah.
If she had held meetings in her home, when she was in the Plymouth colony, I would assume that she would have held meetings
In Boston. Here?
in
Yes.
Boston.
Yes, she did.
Here.
Yeah, she did, that's what she did.
But it wasn't a meeting where they're going to sit down on the Monday night and criticize the minister's sermon from Sunday because there wasn't any minister's sermon from Sunday. Her beliefs in God and everything, yes.
Is there anything written about her her own spirituality or theology?
Yeah, it's in the Jezebel book.
Yeah.
She talks about that in there.
Yeah,
Influence
Yeah.
of the council.
so Eve LaPlante, I went to that talk yesterday, and what she explained is that Anne Hutchinson didn't write anything herself, but a lot of her testimony and her religious beliefs is in her 2 court hearings that she had.
Right, right.
Yeah, so that's it, that's where it comes. Yeah, so it's quoted in the book, and I guess there's pages and pages of documents.
There was more.
Okay, we have to pretty much wrap up because we want to get to the wine tasting at 3 o'clock. And the vineyard, people are probably going a direction.
But the other thing I wanted to mention is that Connecticut was Puritan and Boston was Puritan, and we had the rebels in Rhode Island who did what he did.
We're proud of that.
I just want to add that the original plan, Kim's original plan for the figure on top of the State House was actually a woman, not a man. The drawings by St. Gavin are in the State Archives, and Kim Crossan's happy to show them to anyone.
The Rhode Island State House you're talking about?
Okay, well, thank you all very much.
What do you think?